Hello, welcome to part two of Russia after the Soviet Union. So, Russia is this big, fascinating country. They were the world superpower along with the United States for like 60 or 70 years in the 1900s. Then they collapse in 1991. Then Boris Yeltsin is president, and you have the rise of these oligarchs, and the transition from communism to capitalism is messy. It doesn't go well. The average person, their life does not get much better right after communism falls. So, what happens next? Let's check it out. So, this is part two. You should make sure you watch part one first. The essential questions we went over with part one, here they are again in case you've forgotten them. You can pause the video and watch them again. In 1999, Vladimir Putin becomes president of Russia, and he has been the leader of Russia since then. He was a former leader in the KGB. He became the first he was the prime minister and then a two-term president, which was what was allowed by the Constitution. So then he leaves the presidency and he becomes the prime minister again. And then they amend the Constitution, and then he becomes president for another 2 terms. So he is currently the president of Russia. He first came into power in 1999. There's some great, we're going to talk about him a little bit. I also have a video of him. When he was gaining power, he was trying to boost his reputation. And so there were all these kind of funny pictures of him that were released to the press of him without his shirt on. So I'll share the video of the montage of those. They're just kind of some funny things. I also have a video about his rise to power that goes more in depth than I can do. So what does he do? First of all, he strengthens the central government. He fought the oligarchs, broke up their businesses, arrested some of them, and he elevated the central government, and the oligarchs got demoted a little bit. There are still oligarchs, they're still powerful, but not like they were 20 years ago. Another thing he did some constitutional things. He changed it so instead of having regional governors that were elected by the people, he made regional governors that were appointed by the president, which was him. So he has more control over the politics around the country and the different policies. So he's consolidating power to the central government. A lot of people think that under him, Russia has become more authoritarian, more like a dictatorship, and less democratic. Putin does not really allow critics to get real loud and be very critical of him, so he arrests. Some people have even been assassinated, opposition leaders of opposition parties and members of the press. And they never know like exactly who assassinated these people or how they were poisoned or whatever. But a lot of people think that Putin and the KGB have firm control over the country, and you shouldn't really speak out too much against them or you're putting yourself in danger. However, a lot of Russians like the fact that Putin has created stability for the past 20 years that he has been in charge. The 90s were tumultuous. The economy was crazy. And under Putin, there's been steady economic growth with a couple little recessions, but pretty steady economic growth. And people like the stability. So when Putin was not president, he took his prime minister, and that guy became president for 4 years in 2008. And then when Putin comes president again in 2012, Dmitry Medvedev becomes prime minister. So these two guys have been either president or prime minister for the past 20 years. And the difference between a president and prime minister is that the prime minister is the leader of parliament, which is like Russia's version of Congress. So there's a leader of their parliament, which is like our Congress, and then there's the president. So those two guys have been in charge of both of those positions for 20 years. There was a war in Russia Russia has some territories around its boundaries that they kind of want to be their own country. They sort of want to break free, and one of those places is called Chechnya. They're ethnically different. A lot of them are Muslims and speak a different language, practice a different religion. So they wanted to be their own country. Anyway, there was a civil war or a breakaway. Chechnya was trying to break away. Um, During this war, Islamic extremists, there were terrorists that came into Chechnya and attacked the Russians. And at one point, they took 100 Russians hostage. And in the attempt to free them, they all die. In another case, the Islamic terrorists um, capture 300 school children and kill all of them. So Russia gets pretty upset about this. Putin's in charge. He uses an overwhelming amount of force to win the war. He wins the war and he becomes even more popular. Um, as I mentioned in the last slide, there was a reporter that tried to publish a report about human rights violations by Russian soldiers. The day before her article is supposed to be published, she was killed. Nobody knows exactly who did it, but that's kind of how things sometimes happen under Putin. Positive economic trends. So there have been some really important stuff happening in Russia for the past 20 years. They have a well-educated workforce, and there have been a lot more domestic businesses that have grown up. So in the 90s, it was tough to get businesses started because there was a flood of foreign products. A lot of foreign countries started selling stuff in Russia, and Russian businesses couldn't start on their own. Well, they start in around the year 2000. They start growing their own businesses, and so that's been a positive trend. Russia also becomes a member of the World Trade Organization, which is this big international club of countries who do business together. They do international trade. So Russia has become a member. To become a member, you have to promise to be a nice guy and play fair and that sort of stuff. So Russia did that. Third economic trend, vast oil and natural gas reserves in Siberia have become a great source of wealth and also tax revenue as they're selling that stuff to Europe and Asia. They're making a lot of tax. It's good for the government. The government can run schools and run the military and that sort of stuff. So petroleum and gas, just so you know, make up about 30% of Russia's economy. Here's a graph of the Russian economy. Now, don't pay attention to the blue line. Just look at the red line. This is starting in 95. This is year 2000. The red line is Russia's per capita GDP. So this is real money in people's pockets. So you can see that in 99, right here, the graph starts to go up. There's a little recession, but then it just keeps going up steadily to today. So Russia's economy has been growing steadily. The blue line shows their economy compared to the world economy, and it looks like it goes down, but that's just because places like China and India, their economies are getting fired up. So it's not because Russia's economy is tanking. That's the steady growth that a lot of Russian people appreciate Putin bringing that to their country. One of the biggest gas, petroleum, and natural gas companies is called Gazprom. They sell oil to Europe and China. This map shows where the pipelines are and existing gas and oil pipelines. So you can see a lot of gas and oil coming out of Russia. The dotted lines are proposed pipelines, the pipelines they might add. And so you can see how linked up Russia is. You can see out in Siberia here how they're linked over to China and the Koreas as well. One thing about Gazprom, they're so big, Putin had the government kind of take over the company. And then they had the company buy media companies that were critical of the central government. So Putin has this way of silencing critics in the media. Challenges going ahead for Russia. A lot of the infrastructure is aging. So a lot of things were built in the Soviet era back in the 50s and 60s, 1950s and 1960s, that is. So bridges and roads and airports and pipelines and stuff like that are kind of getting old. There's a big problem with government corruption. So Putin has his friends that own companies. You still kind of have the oligarchs. And so a lot of people in Russia feel like there's corruption in the government, and that there's no free speech and that democracy isn't really free. So that's a problem going forward. Also, what happens after Putin? So his fourth term will be up soon, and they're not sure. Here's a quote I thought was really interesting about him. He strengthened the power of the central government and brought Russia the economic and political stability that many Russians craved. At the same time, Putin has moved Russia away from democracy towards authoritarianism, prompting protests against corruption and Russia's lack of democracy. So going forward, Russia's going to have to figure out what to do about that dynamic. All right, that's the end of Russia after the Soviet Union. If you have any questions, email me or see me in class.